All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, perennial debate. Exactly how does a transcendent faith interact with a man-made social heritage? You see, throughout history, pretty much any time a community of believers finds itself embedded within a larger society, a really profound tension bubbles up. So we're going to break down H. Richard Niebuhr's seminal work to understand the different ways people have historically tried to resolve this exact tension.
It's one single question, right? But it has literally baffled historians, believers, and secularists for 2,000 years, yielding no single neat answer, but rather a really fascinating spectrum of responses. From ancient Rome to our modern industrial societies, Christians have constantly wrestled with whether they should reject the world, totally embrace it, or try to somehow change it. And, as we'll see, the way you answer this question completely changes how you live, how you work, and how you organize society.
To make sense of all this, here is our agenda. First, the enduring problem. Second, against or of culture. Third, the church of the center. Fourth, transforming the culture. And finally, some practical insights for today.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the enduring problem, defining the conflict.
Before we can solve anything, we really need to isolate the exact terms of the conflict we're dealing with here. What's super fascinating is how Niebuhr defines Christ. He doesn't just look at it historically, but defines Christ as a figure who directs devotion entirely away from human achievements and points it toward a transcendent God. He's pointing away from the temporal, day-to-day values of man's social life, the stuff we obsess over constantly, to the one who is the unconditioned creator. Naturally, this creates immediate tension with literally any society that demands our ultimate loyalty.
Then, on the flip side, we have culture. This is the whole shebang of our inescapable social heritage. Anthropologists are quick to note that we cannot escape culture any more easily than we can escape nature. There's no such thing as a man of nature who views the world with completely pristine eyes. We all think, speak, and act using the language, customs, and technical processes handed down to us. So the big puzzle is, how does a faith pointed at the eternal exist within a culture that is inherently bound to the temporary?
Moving right along to Section 2, against or of culture, looking at the extremes. So how did this tension build into the two most extreme reactions historically? Well, looking at the historical text, the debate was intense right out of the gate. In the early days, critics and devoted believers actually agreed on one major thing. Jesus' teachings imperiled the conservation of human civilization. Whether we're talking about Jewish leaders or the mighty Roman Empire, people recognize that if you prioritize the spiritual over the material, the massive but fragile social heritage of civilization might just crumble. We saw this vividly when early believers flat-out refused Roman military service, viewing the empire as totally pagan. Some extreme ascetics even went as far as living on top of tall pillars just to physically escape society. Crazy, right?
It really boils down to a sharp contrast between two extreme wings. On one side, you've got Christ against culture. These are the radicals, like Leo Tolstoy or the early monastic orders, who see secular society as entirely corrupt and push for total withdrawal. On the complete flip side, you have the Christ of culture. Think of accommodators like the Christian Gnostics or modern liberal culture Protestants. They hailed Jesus simply as the great hero and perfecter of human civilization, completely assimilating and blending their faith with whatever the prevailing social ideals happened to be at the time.
This quote hits the nail on the head for that radical position. Klausner, a historian, points out that Jesus didn't come to enlarge art, or knowledge, or economic structures. He actively replaced them with an ethical religious system. Now, for the radical believer, this isn't an insult at all. It's actually a badge of honor. It's the steadfast belief that you must choose solely between the uncompromising authority of Christ or the compromising authority of temporal, political societies. No middle ground.
But here's the catch. Both of these extremes have massive, glaring blind spots. Radicals inevitably end up using cultural ideas anyway. Take the early theologian Tertullian relying heavily on Roman law, or others using Greek philosophy, even while trying to withdraw. They literally use culture to reject culture. Meanwhile, your cultural Christians, who try to perfectly align faith with society, often reduce the gospel to just a utilitarian device for social peace. They end up losing the distinct, transcendent message entirely.
Which brings us to Section 3. The church of the center, holding the tension.
Because those two extremes are so flawed, the vast majority of people throughout history opted for a middle ground, creating these three median approaches. They all basically attempt to maintain that immense gap between God and man while holding our responsibility to both in a really careful, deliberate tension. They recognize we're citizens of a heavenly kingdom, sure, but we are also very firmly planted here on earth. Let's break down each of these three strategies.
First up is synthesis, beautifully exemplified by Thomas Aquinas. In this view, culture isn't inherently evil at all, it actually has a positive preliminary value. We saw this historically when medieval scholars seamlessly integrated Greek philosophy, like Aristotle, right into Christian theology. The idea here is that human reason, philosophy, and social order are good things created by God, but they're incomplete on their own. They need to eventually be crowned by divine intervention from above. It's not an either-or situation, it's a both-and, where grace completes nature.
Synthesis absolutely love the scriptural anchor. Why? Because it completely validates the institutions of society, like governments, laws, and civic duties, as genuinely good and necessary things. But at the same time, it insists they are merely stepping stones to a higher, otherworldly salvation. You do your duty in the culture, absolutely, but your ultimate loyalty is always above it. Then we shift to the second median approach, the dualists. We're talking folks like the Apostle Paul and Martin Luther. They argue that human culture isn't a neat little stepping stone at all. Historically, this manifested in Luther's famous two kingdoms doctrine. Rather than a synthesis, the world is viewed as a deeply flawed, corrupt space where believers just have to endure a necessary, agonizing tension. For the dualist, you're basically caught in this fierce, dynamic battle between the righteousness of God and the unavoidable self-centeredness of human institutions.
So for a dualist, cultural institutions exist largely as negative restraints. They are preventatives of anarchy. They keep a sinful world from completely tearing itself apart, but they definitely do not save you. True freedom is found solely through an inner, spiritual regeneration. You obey the laws of the land, you do your job, but you fundamentally know that this world is broken and you are just passing through.
Now let's jump to Section 4, Transforming the Culture, also known as the conversionist motif.
This leads us to our final and, honestly, perhaps the most dynamic typology on the whole spectrum. This comparison perfectly illustrates the nuance of the center. The synthesist sees culture as good but needing a crown. The dualist sees it as corrupt but necessary to endure. But the conversionist, they believe that while culture is indeed fallen, it is absolutely subject to continuous, infinite redemption. They don't want to just synthesize with it, and they don't want to just endure it. They want to completely transform it.
Heavy hitters like Augustine, John Calvin, and F.D. Maurice championed this. They argued that because God created the world, there is absolutely no phase of human culture, whether it's the economic system, political structures, science, or the arts, over which Christ does not rule and which cannot be positively transformed. Historically, this idea fueled major movements, ranging from Calvin's highly structured Geneva to all sorts of later social reform movements. The ultimate goal here is to convert the culture, bringing the institutions of society into total harmony with the divine will.
All right, final part, Section 5, Insights for Churches Today, the unscientific postscript. Okay, so we've just mapped out this incredibly dense theological framework. But what does this all mean for us, right now, at the complex intersections of faith and society? Well, Niebuhr explicitly concludes that there is no single, scientifically right answer that works for every single person across all of time. Why? Because a small, persecuted sect in the first century simply cannot act the exact same way as a modern, powerful church in an industrial democracy. Our historical and cultural contexts are totally relative, which means our decisions have to be made dynamically, in faith, based on the reality of our current moment.
Here are the big takeaways you should grab from this explainer. Believers must impartially recognize the virtues and the vices of their own unique cultural context. We really have to avoid the trap of thinking our temporary human politics equal the ultimate divine will. Instead, we must make relative decisions in faith, doing our absolute best to maintain the tension between our spiritual devotion and our very real duty to society, all without claiming absolute authority.
So looking at our own modern, rapidly shifting world, with all our crazy technological, political, and social changes, you really have to ask yourself, which of these historical paradigms best guides your own engagement with the world today? Are you withdrawing, accommodating, enduring? Or are you actively trying to transform the culture around you? It's a deeply enduring problem, but how you answer it changes absolutely everything. Thanks for exploring this with us.